Welcome! This is part 5, the 5th video, and thus the concluding video in our 5-part video series on the fascinating story of how the United States acquired all of its vast territory that today comprises the continental United States. So we left off our story last time at looking at how the United States had been expanding. So when the United States was founded, its territory was in New England. So its territory was in the northeast and east. So we've been seeing how the United States has gradually been acquiring more territory as it expanded to the west. So we left off our story at the end of video 4 on the fascinating story of Texas. So at this point, Texas had just declared that it was an independent nation. So it broke away from Mexico, it seceded from Mexico, so Texas was no longer a part of Mexico. Texas had not yet become part of the United States, so Texas was its own independent nation. So let's pick up the story there and jump right into part 5. So almost right from the start, almost right from when Texas declared its independent nation, 1836, Texas turned around and went to the United States and asked the United States to annex Texas. So the people in Texas, these independent people, they wanted to be part of the United States. They did not want to stay as their own independent country, in part because there was this threat by Mexico, who was always trying to take them back. So Texas wanted to become part of the United States. But the United States didn't want to do it. They resisted, and there were really 2 reasons for this. One is because they were reluctant to get into another war, and this time with Mexico, reluctant to trigger a war with Mexico here over this, and that's what Mexico is saying. Mexico is saying, look, this territory is our territory. We don't believe in this nonsense of an independent Texas, so United States, if you annex Texas, we're going to view that as an act of war. So the United States was reluctant to trigger a war with Mexico over that. But also, you had the same question of slavery that this country's been struggling with whenever you bring new territory in. So at the time, Texas had slaves. So these rebels in Texas, they were slaveholders. So by annexing Texas into the United States would mean they would be bringing a new slaveholding state into the United States. And this was just a can of worms. This was the can of worms that we saw for the Missouri Compromise when the Louisiana territory was, they tried to bring the Louisiana territory into the United States. It was a big mess. So that's why the United States was reluctant, and they were not annexing Texas, despite Texas's pleas to please annex us. So then along comes the presidential election of 1844. So this is 8 years later, so Texas has been an independent nation all by itself for 8 years now. And along comes the presidential election. Now, initially, in the lead up to the presidential election, you had the 2 presumptive candidates of their parties, and both of those candidates took the same position, which was, let's not annex Texas. And really the reason was because of this question of slavery. It just neither one of these candidates wanted to address this issue and open a whole new can of worms. So it seemed that this issue of Texas was not going to be an issue in the presidential election of 1844. It was, nobody's even talking about it because the candidates agreed, we're not going to annex Texas. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, comes this candidate by the name of James Polk. And he comes out and says, we need to annex Texas. Okay, this is his platform. He is very hard charging. Now, he's from Tennessee. He held slaves. He'd been a slave. His family had been a slaveholder. He'd been a slaveholder all his life. And he said, we need to bring Texas into the Union as a slaveholding state. James Polk was advocating this sentiment that became known as manifest destiny. So basically what manifest destiny was a reason why the United States should continue expanding its territory, so acquiring more and more territory all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. So this concept of manifest destiny was controversial, then and now. So let me sort of give you both sides of the arguments on manifest destiny. So the proponents of manifest destiny would say, that we should acquire more territory, this territory, and expand our nation. Why? Well, one reason is because, this is part of God's plan for America. This is destiny, right? This is divine providence, right? So God wants us to do this. It's part of God's plan to acquire this territory. So that was one argument. The other sort of another justification for this, for acquiring territories, because look, America has created this new wonderful form of government, democracy. So this is a new age. This is an enlightened form of government. So it makes sense that this form of government should be spread to other territories. These old forms of government were horrible. These were the tyrannical monarchs and tyrannical kings and dictators. So this form of government is far better. The democracy it brings freedom to people. It is self-governance. It brings liberty to people. So this is good for all sorts of people. And these other forms of government had, a rigid class structure. If you were either born in nobility or you were born in the peasantry, and if you were born in the peasantry, you have no hope. You can never better yourself. But with this form of government, with democracy and the American democracy, it doesn't matter what class you're born into. You can be born into a poor family, and as long as you work hard, you can become successful and become wealthy. So this is a wonderful form of government. America, this form of government is like the shining city on the hill, and thus this form of government should be spread throughout the land to other people. And in fact, some of these people, these proponents of manifest destiny, felt it was their obligation to spread it to other people. So just like it's their obligation to, help a lady crossing the street, or helping a poor person or something, it's their obligation to spread this form of enlightened government to other people all across the nation. And that's why we should acquire this additional territory, because it's a wonderful thing and everybody's going to appreciate it and love it eventually. So that was the proponents of manifest destiny. Now, the critics of manifest destiny had a very different view. So the critics of manifest destiny would say, well, look, it is wrong for America to acquire property that doesn't belong to America. Okay? The property belongs to someone else, and it's wrong to take that property from someone else. It doesn't matter what your reasons are for justifying it, it's wrong. So the reasons that have been given by the proponents of that it's part of God's plan, and that it's some divine providence or something is that is not a justification. We are a people of laws. We follow the rule of law, and saying that this is God's plan, therefore I'm going to do it, is not following the rule of law. And in fact, you could use that to justify anything. You could go off and murder somebody and say, oh, God wanted me to do it. It's part of God's plan for me to do it. It's not a justification. So they didn't agree with that part of it. They would also say that this form of this idea that American democracy is this wonderful form of government, and therefore it should be spread to other people. What they would say is, well, that's fine. We agree with that, but only if the other people agree. So you can make the arguments to the other people and say, wouldn't you love to become part of America because it's such a great form of government? And if they say yes, then that's fine. Then you can acquire that territory with their consent and incorporate them into the United States. That's fine. But if they say no, thank you, we don't want to be part of the United States, we don't think your form of government is superior, we like ours, thank you very much, then you have to agree with it. You can't just take their property. And these critics would say that there is an aspect of manifest destiny that is superior. It's this sense of superiority that is unjustified. And it's basically saying, well, our form of government is superior to yours, therefore we're justified in imposing our superior form of government on you. And they would say, in particular, that was true with the Native American population. So, the sentiment was, this is what the critics say, the sentiment was that the people who wanted to take these territories away from the Native Americans basically felt that, the Native Americans were unsophisticated and uncivilized, and therefore it is better for us to impose our form of government upon them. So what these critics would say is that's not justified. The Native Americans had their own culture, and if they did not want to be part of the American system, then they should have the ability to say no. So those are sort of the two sides of this manifest destiny concept that were certainly controversial and controversial today. And this concept exists today. I mean, you see this in politics today. It's not called manifest destiny because that really has a component to it of acquiring new territory. But the term you see today is American exceptionalism. So you see that in contemporary politics frequently it's one party asking the other, do you believe in American exceptionalism, and trying to get them to say yes or no. And is American exceptional in the sense that, well, yes, this is a superior form of government, and so it's good to spread it, versus no, American exceptionalism is bad because it ends up imposing the American government on people who don't want it. So those are the two sides that you see in contemporary politics today. So, but back then it was manifest destiny, and this is what James Polk was arguing as the candidate. So, as a result of his platform, he ends up becoming the party's nominee. So he wins the party's nominee. So there was another guy who was actually the favorite, who was the presumptive nominee. But when James Polk started making this argument, it proved popular, and he wins the nomination. So he ends up then going to the general election where he's running for president against the other party. And he continues with this platform of manifest destiny. So his campaign, so there were two properties that were really under consideration here for acquisition. One was Texas, that we've been talking about, and the other was the Oregon country. So the Oregon country was way in the northwest corner of America. It is, the two states today are Oregon and Washington. So these were the two properties that were sort of under consideration for acquisition. And in his campaign, James Polk was acquiring manifest destiny, advocating for manifest destiny. We should absolutely acquire both of these properties, bring them into the United States. And he was, stirring up passions of, American greatness and American nativism and patriotic sentiment, and stirring up sort of popular sentiment. And he ends up winning the presidential election on this platform of manifest destiny. So in 1844, he wins the presidential election, and James Polk becomes the president of the United States. So what did he do as president? Well, he did continue this notion of manifest destiny. So with respect to the Oregon Territory, so the Oregon Territory had been it had been disputed for years, for decades actually, and it was disputed mainly between Britain and the United States. Although Spain had a claim to it also, but Spain gave up that claim in that Treaty of 1819. So Britain owns Canada, which is above the Oregon Territory. So Britain shares a border with the Oregon Territory. That's why they felt it should belong to Britain. But the United States now owns the Louisiana Territory, which shares the border with the Oregon Territory. So the United States said, no, this should be our territory. So what ended up happening, actually it was decades ago, Britain and the United States had been trying to agree on a border for this territory, and they couldn't do it. So what they agreed, this is back in 1818 actually, they agreed to share it. Okay, so for decades now, the United States and Britain had been sharing the Oregon Territory. But this wasn't working out. I mean, it was supposed to be temporary. Actually, the sharing arrangement was supposed to be temporary. We'll share it just on a temporary basis until we can work out actual borders. But they could never work out actual borders, so it kept getting extended and extended and extended, and then it went on for decades. But now it was becoming, there were a bunch of conflicts. The conflicts were increasing, the disputes were continuing, so it became apparent that we really need to work out some borders here in this territory. This is the portion of the Oregon Territory in the United States, and it's superimposed on a contemporary map of the United States to give us a sense of the area that we're talking about. So this is the northwest corner of the United States. Here you can see California. Here's the border with California, and this is the modern-day state of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho. So this is a view of the larger area. So this portion here is what we just saw. This is the portion in the United States. Here is the borderline with California. Now it says Mexico, but Mexico owned California at the time. So this is the borderline with California. And interestingly, you can see the Oregon Trail coming in as well. The Oregon Trail was the famous Oregon Trail where all these settlers from the United States were moving out west and taking the Oregon Trail and moving into Oregon. This is actually a reason of what necessitated these negotiations to determine the boundaries of this area, because so many U.S. settlers were pouring into Oregon. So this is the portion in the United States. This is the portion of what was in Canada today. And then this boundary up here is the boundary with Alaska. So this combined portion, the portion that's in Canada today and the portion that's in the United States today, this combined portion is what was being shared by Britain and the United States. So in order to create some boundaries here on this territory, the United States proposed, hey, why don't we just split it in the middle here and split it along this line of the 49th parallel. And this makes a lot of sense because this territory over here, we've already agreed to the 49th parallel between Britain and the United States. So why don't we just take this same line that we've already agreed on and extend it into the Oregon Territory? And Britain came back and said, well, we agree with part of that, but not all of it. They said, we're fine with that on this part, so we're fine with giving this territory to the United States, but we don't like it over here on this part, so we, Britain, want to keep this part. And the reason was because of the Columbia River. So the Columbia River was extremely important for transportation. Britain had a number of forts on the Columbia River, including Fort Vancouver, and this area was very important for the fur trade. It was the lucrative fur trade. So the United States said, well, no, we don't like that because of the same reason. The Columbia River was very important to the United States, so they wanted to control this area. So the real dispute was really around this portion here, this territory here and the Columbia River, because the parties were okay with the rest of these borders. So it was really, the dispute was centered around this area right here. Britain and the United States were at loggerheads on this negotiation about setting boundaries in the Oregon Territory. So, the more fervent portion of the Manifest Destiny folks wanted Polk to grab the whole thing, to grab the entire territory, not only the part that's in the United States, but also the part that's in Canada, all the way up to Alaska. And in fact, this is what Polk campaigned on. When he was campaigning for president, he said, he's a Manifest Destiny guy. He said, I'll take the whole thing. I'll take the whole Oregon Territory. I'll take it all the way up to Alaska. And this was known as the All Oregon position. So, so negotiations are kind of stalling here with Britain, and Polk starts to take some aggressive moves. So he moves to cancel the treaty under which this territory had been shared. So for decades, there was this treaty where Britain and the United States were both sharing this Oregon Territory, and Polk moves to cancel that treaty. So that suggests that, the next move is going to be, he's going to, take some territory here, and who knows how much territory he's going to take. So, and it is potentially risking war. Right, so this kind of angers Britain and people in the United States, and the negotiators end up sharpening their pencil and they reach a compromise deal. So the compromise deal is that Britain agreed to the 49th parallel line, and the United States agreed to allow Britain to continue to have access to the Columbia River. So seemed like a decent compromise. However, the people in Polk's party who voted for him, who were these fervent Manifest Destiny people, were furious with Polk because to them this was a betrayal. When Polk was campaigning, he said he'd take all the territory up to Alaska. So now he ended up compromising at the 49th parallel, and he only took half of it. So they were upset at Polk. But it was pretty widely viewed that this was a fair and reasonable compromise. And in fact, Congress ratified it very quickly. And some commentators said that, this is an example of how nations should act as grown-ups, how grown-up nations can actually, have compromises and reach compromises without having to go to war and kill people. So Oregon becomes part of the United States. And this was significant because for the first time, the United States has its own territory that provides it access to the Pacific Ocean. So the United States expands its footprint to include Oregon. So that's Oregon. But what about Texas? We left off on Texas. So let's go back to Texas. So Texas had declared its independence from Mexico, and Texas was acting as its own independent country, and in which Mexico did not recognize. But in the election, the presidential election, Polk said that he would annex Texas. So now that he's been elected president, what does Polk do? He annexes Texas. Okay, now this was, a big problem for Mexico, and it certainly is threatening war because Mexico said if you take Texas, this, potentially means war here. But Polk does it. So there's problem down here on the border, the southern border with Texas. So after he's elected, Polk sends an emissary to Mexico to try to negotiate to purchase this land from Mexico. So he wanted to purchase not only Texas, but also more of the land like New Mexico and all the way to the Pacific Ocean, so California. But Mexico said, no, we don't want to sell that land. This is our land. This is our country. We've held this land for hundreds of years. No, we don't want to sell. So Polk was not very happy about this. So there's trouble down here on the southern border. So one problem was Texas, that Polk annexed Texas, so that was a problem in and of itself. But another problem within this problem was the boundary of Texas. What was the boundary of Texas between Texas and Mexico? The border dispute was over what is today the southern tip of Texas. So this map reflects the current borders of Texas. So on this side you have Mexico, and on this side you have Texas. And the disputed territory was down here at the tip between the Nueces River to the north and the Rio Grande River about 150 miles to the south. And the disputed territory in between became known as the Nueces Strip. So Mexico's argument was that the boundary between Texas and Mexico should be at the Nueces River, and therefore this disputed territory would belong to Mexico. The United States' argument, however, was that the boundary between Texas and Mexico should be at the Rio Grande River, which would mean that the disputed territory would belong to the United States. So President James Polk sends the army down into the area under the command of General Zachary Taylor. And Taylor's men line up here along the Nueces River to the north. So when Mexico sees this, Mexico warns the United States. Mexico says, do not send your troops across the Nueces River. Do not send your troops into this disputed territory, because it's only going to lead to trouble and conflict and potentially war. So what does James Polk do? He sends the army into the disputed territory. So Zachary Taylor's army crosses the Nueces River and heads down into the disputed territory. So, perhaps not unexpectedly, conflict results. So there's a patrol of 70 U.S. soldiers, and they bump into the Mexican army at some point here in the disputed territory. Shots are fired, and 15 United States soldiers are killed. Polk seizes on this as his reason for going to war. So what he says is, America has just been invaded. And American blood has been shed on American soil. So he rushes into Congress with a declaration for war. And Congress, wow, if America's just been invaded and American blood has been shed on American soil, that's a pretty good reason for going to war. So Congress passes the Declaration of War in 1846, and the Mexican-American War is underway. Now you might be saying to yourself, wait a minute, what? America's been invaded? And you're right, there are a number of critics of this, and it did seem that Polk, may have been looking for a reason to go to war here. So, this claim that America had been invaded was, somewhat of a dubious claim. I mean, it certainly wasn't American. It wasn't like a foreign country was marching on Washington or something. This was disputed territory. I mean, in Texas to start with, the fact that the U.S. annexed Texas was a problem to start with. But even just in this smaller area, not sure that was really clearly American soil. It was disputed territory under a legitimate dispute. But also, Polk is the one that sent his army down into this territory as opposed to being invaded by somebody else. And Polk was warned not to. That the Mexicans told him, do not send your troops into this disputed area, otherwise it's going to cause a conflict. And what did he do? He did it anyway. So it was somewhat of a a provocation. And the idea that the American blood was shed on American soil, again, not very clear that this was American soil. So this whole reason was of somewhat questionable authority in the first place. Also, apparently, Polk had been looking for a reason for a war for some time, and in fact, he had prepared a document that he was planning to submit to Congress for going to war. And what his reason was so remember when he sent his emissary into Mexico to try to negotiate the purchase of this territory, the Mexican government had rejected his emissary, and Polk was prepared to say that was the cause for war, that they rejected my emissary, therefore we're going to go to war. And he had actually prepared a document that he was going to submit to Congress. But when this incident happened, the shooting happened, he said, this is a much better reason, and he changed the language in the document and relied on this reason instead of the other reason. So it does seem that Polk was just really out to go to war no matter what, and he was just looking for a reason to go to war. So this was very controversial. The war was very controversial and very political, even at the time on sort of both sides. So when Polk was making his case for the war, there were a number of reasons that he gave, and him and his pro-war contingency. So one of them was that that America had been invaded. So that one seems a little dubious. Another reason that he gave was he said, well, some of these lands, like in Arizona and the eastern portion of California, not on the shore, but the eastern portion of California, some of these areas, they're not really well populated, and so it's more like frontier land as opposed to Mexican land. So Mexico doesn't really have a strong claim to that land. And by the way, there's some settlers, U.S.-speaking settlers that went in who are there. So it's really more our land anyway. So we should just take it. So this claim seems, dubious as well. I mean, you think about that today. The U.S. today would certainly never allow some foreign country to come into the United States and say, oh yeah, that land area didn't really have very many people living there, and so and some of our immigrants live there, so we're just going to take it for ourselves. Doesn't really seem to fly. And also, it wasn't just sparsely populated land that was being taken. It was all these ports on the coast of California and a lot of populated land. So that reason seems dubious. Another reason they gave was they said, well, if we don't take this land, then Britain is going to take it, and it's better that we take it than having Britain take it. So this seems kind of dubious as well. Now, there was some legitimacy that Britain might take it. I mean, Britain was an empire; they were certainly grabbing land as well. But there was no evidence that Britain was about to grab this land. There was certainly nothing imminent at all. So it doesn't really seem like a justification. Another reason they gave for this pro-war for going to war was they said, well, Mexico, so there had been some bond issuances, and Mexico owed some money to the U.S. bondholders under some bonds, and this was in the aftermath of the Mexican War for Independence. So they said, we're not sure that Mexico really has a lot of money, not sure that Mexico is going to be able to pay off this debt. So as a result, let's just take all this land from Mexico. So again, this doesn't seem to be a valid justification either. I mean, Mexico may have paid off that land, but also wasn't part of the deal that, if they didn't pay, that all this land would be taken. So, that doesn't really seem persuasive. So, but there were a number of groups that were pro-war. So one group that was pro-war was this Manifest Destiny group, right? They were like, yeah, let's just grab a bunch of territory. Let's go to war and grab as much territory as we can. In fact, the more fervent wing of this group, they wanted the U.S. to grab not only all the territory to the ocean, but they wanted the U.S. to go south and grab all of Mexico. So they were in favor of this war. Another group in favor of the war was the southern slave states. So they were in favor of the war because they saw a potential opportunity here for the United States to acquire more slave-holding territory, and that would increase, their power in Congress. So there, on the other side, there was a number of groups that were against the war as well. There was a powerful anti-war group, although not that powerful, because they were not successful. So one of those groups were the northern free states. So for the same reason as the slave-holding states wanted the war, the free states did not want the war, and it's because they were worried that, in fact, this would bring in additional slave-holding states into the Union, and it would give the slave-holding states more power in Congress. But there was also just sort of a general anti-war sentiment with, a number of people opposed to the war just on moral grounds that it was wrong, and the reasons that Polk had given were not adequate justifications and that sort of thing. So there were some members of Congress who stood on the floor and said, it is wrong that for America to kill Mexican people to grab their land just because America wants the land. It's just wrong. So there was that, and actually there was a story related to the anti-war folks, which was, so the writer Henry David Thoreau, so he's this sort of naturalist, humanist writer. He was opposed to the war, so he stopped paying his poll taxes, and the reason was because he said, I don't want to finance this war. I don't want to contribute to financing this war that is so wrong. So when the authorities came to him and said, look, you got to pay your taxes, he said, I'm not paying because I don't want to finance the war. They took him and they threw him in the clink. So he was in jail, although he was in jail only for one night, because the next day one of his family members came and bailed him out. Unbeknownst to him, he was actually upset when they bailed him out because he did not want to be bailed out. He wanted to stay in jail as a sort of symbol of protest for a while. So, but nonetheless, he was in jail. And so as the story goes, his friend, also the writer, Ralph Waldo Emerson, came and visited Thoreau while he was in jail. And Emerson asks Thoreau, Henry, what are you doing in there? And Thoreau responds and says, Waldo, what are you doing out there? So the implication is, what are you doing out there? You too should be protesting. You too should not be paying your taxes. If you're out there, you should be against this war and doing what you can to stop it. So it's a very funny story, although it might be apocryphal. But nonetheless, the point of the story is certainly true. This is why Thoreau went to jail. Also, he really did go to jail. That part is true. And in fact, it was this experience of him spending this night in jail, this experience is what led him to then write his very famous essay on civil disobedience. So there were a number of people who were against the war, but nonetheless, Polk was able to push this declaration through Congress quickly, and Congress, approved the declaration of war in 1846, and thus the Mexican-American War was underway. The war basically consisted of the United States invading Mexico from all sorts of different directions. So the United States sent troops over this way, all the way over to California. Here they took Sonoma, which is today the famous wine country. The United States also sent in Navy to help with taking cities along the coast. So the United States took San Francisco. The United States took Santa Barbara, Los Angeles. Actually, there were a number of battles at Los Angeles. And finally, the Mexican commander surrendered at what is now West Hollywood. So the United States took San Diego. The Navy continued down the coast of Baja California, took a number of cities here. The Navy blockaded, so took control of the Gulf of California. The United States sent troops down this way into what is today New Mexico, like down into Santa Fe and Albuquerque, down across this way and this way, taking towns of Mexico. And then down here, this was how the war started. This was sort of, you can see the boundary of Texas. This is the Nueces River here, and this is the Nueces Strip, where there was the disputed territory where the war started. So Zachary Taylor and his army went in here at the orders of Polk, which started the war, and then Zachary Taylor continued to push into Mexico when the war started, and he came down here and took Monterrey. And there were a number of battles in Monterrey, actually some pretty difficult battles, and Zachary Taylor actually emerged as a hero in some of these battles. Now, it wasn't enough for the United States just to stay up here and take this sort of stuff. The United States also said, you know what, let's invade the Mexico capital. Let's invade Mexico City, the capital of Mexico. Okay, and to do this, they didn't just keep sending Zachary Taylor to keep pushing down south, but in fact, Polk sent an entirely separate army. And this one came from New Orleans, and it came by sea. This army was commanded by General Winfield Scott. Now, Winfield Scott was this old, famous military guy. In fact, he was widely regarded as the greatest military commander of his day. So he commands this part of the war. It was an amphibious landing, actually, meaning that you put all your stuff on the boats and then you land at shore, and you have to bring it all on shore. And this was regarded as one of the first amphibious landings in U.S. military history. So, it's a huge undertaking because you have to unload all your stuff, all your men, all your equipment, all your artillery, your supplies. In fact, this was sort of a precursor to D-Day in World War II, 100 years later. So that was when the United States, along with its allies, landed on the coast of Normandy. That was an amphibious landing as well, that was depicted in Steven Spielberg's movie, actually, the Saving Private Ryan, right at the beginning, the first 10 minutes, which was a pretty tough scene, but it was a great movie. So Winfield Scott does this amphibious landing here at Veracruz, and incidentally, under Winfield Scott's command here, as part of this mission, were a number of military generals who would become famous in the Civil War that was only, a dozen years off. So it included both Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. So Grant was the guy who became the head of the army in the North in the Civil War, and Robert E. Lee was the guy who became the head of the army in the South in the Civil War. So those guys ended up fighting against each other, whereas here they were fighting together on the same team. And there were a number of other Civil War generals as well, including like Stonewall Jackson and a number of others. So these guys land here at Veracruz, make their amphibious landing. They have some battles there, but they are successful and they get a toehold here. And then they turn inward and march towards Mexico City. Now, this sounds very familiar because it's almost a repeat of Cortez's expedition back in 1519, when the Spaniards initially explored Mexico, came into Mexico City, conquered Mexico City and the great Aztec Empire for the first time. This is basically a repeat of that. So Winfield Scott is marching to Mexico City, and guess who is president of Mexico at this time? Well, it's our old friend Santa Anna. He's back. So Santa Anna was the guy who was president of Mexico, who stepped down as president to lead the military charge when Texas was declaring its independence. So he led the military army into the Alamo, had the battle at the Alamo, and then chased Sam Houston's army across Texas until Sam Houston turned on him at what is now Houston, Texas, and wiped out the Mexican army. And Santa Anna was deposed by his country, and he was sent into exile. Well, he came back from exile, and now again he's president leading this war too. So you've got Winfield Scott marching toward Mexico, and he faces Santa Anna in battles at Mexico City. Well, things don't go well for Santa Anna. The poor guy, he lost Texas, and then he comes down here and loses Mexico City. So the United States prevails. The United States occupies Mexico City, takes over Mexico City. So things are not looking so good here for Mexico. A number of their major cities are occupied by the United States. Mexico is vastly outnumbered by the United States military, and it just doesn't seem like Mexico is going to be able to defend itself here in the war. So Mexico is forced to enter into a treaty to end the war in 1848. And in this treaty, Mexico cedes a vast amount of territory to the United States. So this territory is depicted here in white. You can see it is a huge amount of territory. Now remember, the war started down here in the corner of Texas over a little border dispute over a little area here between Texas and Mexico. This is what James Polk sent the Zachary Taylor into, and that's what started the war down here. But as you can see, Polk had his eye not just on acquiring this little sliver, but he had his eye on a lot more. And this was the, this doctrine of manifest destiny. So in fact, when he went to try to buy the territory from Mexico initially, before the war, he was trying to buy this territory, but Mexico did not want to sell. But Polk ended up acquiring it anyway, but this time through war. So you can see this amount of territory is just huge, particularly in comparison to the size of Mexico. So prior to the war, Mexico owned all this territory and all this territory down to here. So by giving up this territory, Mexico gave up more than half of its territory in this war. So that is huge, a huge loss. And by the United States, this is a huge amount of territory for the United States to acquire. In fact, the United States increased its territory by about a third here. So this is just a tremendous amount of territory to gain here. Now, the United States did pay Mexico $15 million as part of this treaty, but that amount, $15 million, was less than half of what the United States was offering when it tried to buy this territory prior to the war. How did the American citizens feel about this war? Well, one of these war generals, Zachary Taylor, immediately after the war was elected President of the United States. And he was elected because of his status as a war hero. He was not really a politician. So this suggests that there was this sort of popular sentiment, this patriotic fervor that was afoot in the United States that brought this war general to become president. But that wasn't the only sentiment. There were other people as well in the United States who felt that this war was not just and was not proper. In fact, Ulysses S. Grant, General Grant, the guy who won the Civil War for the North, he had also fought in this Mexican War, and he reflected upon this later in his life. So this is decades later when he wrote his memoirs. But what he said was that the Mexican War represented one of the worst examples of a stronger nation preying upon a weaker nation and not considering principles of justice in its thirst for acquiring more territory. So that's a pretty harsh criticism of the war. And indeed, there are a number of people to this day who believe that this war represented something of a black mark on the history of the United States. But regardless, what the war did do is it ended the presence of the Spanish Empire in this territory that is now the United States. Now, it was Mexico then, but there were certainly strong vestiges of the Spanish Empire in Mexico. So this war ended Spanish rule in the territory of the United States. Now, even though Spanish rule was ended, certainly Spanish culture was not ended. I mean, the Spanish had been in this area for over 300 years. They began exploring and colonizing this area in the early 1500s. So they had been in this land for over 300 years. So even though their rule was over, their culture certainly survives to this day. In fact, think about a number of the names of these cities. Los Angeles, San Diego, San Francisco. These are all Spanish names, and indeed, all these cities were founded by the Spanish. And think of Spanish food, Mexican food, right? It's huge in the United States. And the Spanish language, is a significant language that is spoken in the United States to this day. So the legacy of the Spanish presence in the United States is certainly alive and very rich to this day. So that is the story. This is the story of how the United States came to be the way it is today. So it started when these Native American people came into this territory 15,000 years ago. So the Native Americans had been here for thousands of years. But then when Christopher Columbus sailed across the ocean in 1492 and discovered America, this kicked off this era of European empires coming in and occupying and owning this United States territory. So it was Spain, France, England, and the Netherlands, the Dutch. So for these, these European empires owned the United States for 200 to 300 years. So this was indeed a significant period. But then these colonists who were in the area of the British Empire, they decided that they wanted independence. So they kicked off the American Revolution, and this was the birth of the United States. This reflects the original territory of the original United States when it won its independence from Great Britain in 1783. And then 20 years later, the United States acquired the Louisiana Territory when it bought it from Napoleon and France. Now this left Florida looking a little vulnerable. So a few years later, the United States ended up acquiring Florida in a treaty with Spain. So Spain continued to own this territory over here. And then 25 years later, in 1844, James Polk was elected, and he was a member of the view of manifest destiny. And it is extraordinary to think that in the next 4 years, the entire rest of this territory would become part of the United States. So in 1845, the United States annexed Texas, and the following year, the United States acquired its portion of the Oregon Territory in 1846, and this was through a compromise with Great Britain. So it was agreed in a compromise to use the 49th parallel as the boundary. The United States took the lower portion here, and Britain took the upper portion here in what is now Canada. So the annexation of Texas in 1845 kicked off the Mexican-American War, which lasted 2 years and ended in 1848 and resulted in the acquisition of this vast amount of territory in the Southwest and West. So this pretty much brings us up to date with the current boundaries of today's United States, and it shows how the United States expanded from coast to coast. This is the story of how the continental United States territory came to be the way that it is today. So this brings to an end our journey together. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, although maybe watching was your manifest destiny. See you next time.